From APM, American Public Media.
Baptist Health is a proud supporter of First Coast Connect. Baptist Health, committed to building a healthier community for all of us. More info at 202-4YOU or baptistjacks.com.
So the situation here is we would be sitting around having conversation, and then the topic would change mid-sentence. Whenever that would happen, someone would say Jack Roses, and that signals whatever we were just talking about, we're not talking about anymore, we've moved on.
They use words there now that you don't hear anywhere else in the world. I watched a heave and catch the fall.
Join us this week on Away with Words.
Tomorrow at 11, here on WJCT News 89.9.
This is WJCT News 89.9 Jacksonville. Up next, national and local news from NPR and the WJCT News team.
Good morning, I'm Ann Schindler, and on today's First Coast Connect, it's the biggest stories of the week. Florida's murder capital celebrates a plummeting homicide rate. A social media ban for minors takes effect statewide. A New Year's attack on New Orleans merges domestic and international terrorism concerns. Recent storms spread invasive species across the state, and the door opens on city liability for homelessness. We'll talk about all that and more with our panel of journalists on our Friday Week in Review. Later, the star of The Last Tango in Paris is the subject of a critically acclaimed movie. We'll discuss that and all upcoming screenings at the St. Augustine Film Fest. You can join the conversation live on air by calling 904-549-2937 or emailing First Coast Connect at WJCT.org. It's all ahead this hour after the day's news.
I'm from NPR News in Washington. I'm Corva Coleman. The FBI says the man who killed 14 people in New Orleans this week acted alone. The driver who crashed into crowds also injured dozens of others before he was shot and killed by police. More information is being released about those who died. The Gulf States newsroom's Drew Hawkins reports on how one family has been devastated by their loss.
Kareem Badawi just finished his first semester at the University of Alabama, where he was studying engineering. His father, Bilal Badawi, says he was an 18-year-old full of life.
He just loved everything, and he loved sports, and he played baseball, played basketball, he played football.
Badawi says his son went to New Orleans with a group of friends. When he didn't answer his phone the next morning, they drove to the city to find him. Eventually, the FBI told them Kareem had been killed.
And I asked my son to have a New Year and a party with his friends, and I don't know, ma'am. I mean, what did my son do to get killed?
A vigil was held at Kareem's former high school in Baton Rouge. For NPR News, I'm Drew Hawkins in New Orleans.
President Biden says he is going to block the sale of U.S. steel to Japanese company Nippon Steel. He says a strong domestically owned steel company is an essential national security priority. The decision caps about a year of uncertainty over whether the sale of the company would proceed. President Biden will award the Medal of Honor today to 7 U.S. Army soldiers who served during Korea and Vietnam. NPR's Lexi Shapitl reports.
The nation's highest military decoration, the Medal of Honor, is awarded to service members demonstrating exceptional valor in combat. 6 men will receive the award posthumously, including Private First Class Charles R. Johnson, who was killed in a nighttime attack in Korea in 1953 after risking his life to administer first aid to his fellow soldiers. Johnson's efforts are credited with saving the lives of as many as 10 people. Captain Hugh R. Nelson Jr. was killed in Vietnam in 1966 after rescuing a soldier injured in a helicopter crash. The White House says all 7 men receiving the Medal of Honor today displayed, quote, gallantry and intrepidity in their service. Lexi Shapitl, NPR News, Washington.
The new Congress starts work today, and the first thing the House needs to do is vote for a new speaker. Current Speaker Mike Johnson wants to keep his job, but some very conservative Republican colleagues are on the fence about him. Republicans hold the slimmest of majorities in the House. That means Johnson can only afford to lose 1 vote for Speaker. Georgia Republican Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene says she is supporting Johnson.
I cannot wait to get started. I'll be voting for Mike Johnson. I will be looking ahead in complete hopefulness and working as hard as possible.
But one GOP lawmaker is already opposing Johnson. That means he cannot lose any more GOP support. It's NPR.
And you're listening to WJCT News 89.9 in Jacksonville. Good morning. I'm Stephen Ponson. It's now 9:04. The Betty Griffin Center already provides counseling and other services to victims of sexual assault at UF Health St. John's near St. Augustine, but a new partnership will bring those services to St. Johns County's north side. The nonprofit organization is partnering with Ascension St. Vincent's St. John's Hospital near Nocatee to provide more services to victims of sexual assault. Now, people who go to the hospital will have the opportunity to speak with a trained counselor confidentially and for free. If you've been the victim of sexual assault, you can contact the Betty Griffin Center by phone at 904-824-1555. Two Jaguars players have been selected as starters at the NFL's Pro Bowl games in Orlando this season. Punter Logan Cook and long snapper Ross Matisic were the two players from the Jags selected as starters from the American Football Conference. Defensive ends Josh Hines Allen and Trayvon Walker and wide receiver Brian Thomas Jr. were selected as alternates, meaning if someone can't play in the events, then they'll be selected. The NFL's version of an all-star competition will be in Orlando this year with a skills competition on Thursday, January 30th, and a flag football game at Camping World Stadium Sunday, February 2nd. It's going to be a cold afternoon here in Northeast Florida. Highs will be in the 60s today under sunny skies. Mostly clear tonight. Lows getting down in the mid to lower 30s.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include the William T. Grant Foundation, supporting research to improve the lives of young people. Online at wtgrantfoundation.org. And listeners like you who donate to this NPR station.
Support for First Coast Connect is provided in part by Baptist Health and North Florida TPO.
Opinions expressed on the First Coast Connect Week in Review are those of our panelists and do not reflect the views of WJCT News 89.9.
Good morning. It's Friday, and I'm Ann Schindler. It's time for our First Coast Week in Review. Among our topics, murders in Jacksonville dip to the lowest levels in a century. A new law takes effect requiring spectators to stay at least 25 feet away from police activity. Bourbon Street attacks rattle cities nationwide. Reports show hurricanes that hit the state are spreading more than just damage, and cities now face lawsuits if homelessness persists. Here to talk about all of that and more, I am joined by Rich Donnelly, anchor and reporter at First Coast News. Good morning, Rich.
Good morning, Ann. Thanks for having me.
Nikesha Williams, author and columnist for Jacksonville Today. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Good morning. Good morning, Jacksonville.
David Bauerlein, Metro reporter at the Florida Times-Union. Hey, David.
Good morning and Happy New Year, everybody.
And Aaron Farrar, weekend anchor and reporter at News4Jax. Good morning, Aaron.
Good morning. Glad to be back.
Nice to have you back. I want to start, David, if we can, with a big headline from your publication this week about a startling decline, I think, in the homicide rate in Jacksonville. I guess I should say it was, predicted somewhat by the numbers over the summer that you published, but this trend has proven staying power in Jacksonville. So what's going on here? What do we know about the numbers?
Yeah, it's a stunning turnaround. So there's been like a drop by more than a half, or roughly half, in the number of homicides year over year. And that's just incredible when you look at what's led up to that. I mean, Jacksonville, Duval County historically have been a real problem area in terms of homicides, murders, the so-called murder capital of the state. And so for this kind of a turnaround to happen, it really is stunning. And it kind of feels a little bit like the old overnight success story that really didn't happen overnight. I mean, I think there has been some real change that's happened this year. And a big question going forward would be whether it sticks. But this has come after years and years of efforts, not just by law enforcement, although that's been a big part of it, but also just in terms of beefing up funding for things like the Kids Hope Alliance, social service programs. Those kind of things don't pay off in a year. And so it's surprising that it's all come together in just one 12-month period in terms of that dramatic drop. But it certainly does show the numbers have something's happening out there that's good and positive for the city, and particularly for neighborhoods that for decades have faced this real scourge of just gun violence in them.
Yeah, and we should say that for the last 12 years, according to the Florida Times Union, there have been at least 100 victims of homicides, and this is 83 unofficially. There's some numbers that could still tweak depending on solve rate and things like that, but 83 this year. That's the lowest since 2011. And I think it's interesting that you talk about the other initiatives because that was a time when there also were these other initiatives in place that a lot of people credited with a decline in violent crime.
It was, and the thing about the Jacksonville journey, which took place at that time, there was a real sharp decrease, and it almost felt a little bit too good to be true. Can you really turn things around that fast? And it turned out that it sort of was because the crime rate, the murder rate did go back up to levels that were as bad as it's been in a long time.
After that program
After that
was
program,
defunded,
it was
essentially.
defunded, it was cut back, it was reconfigured, that kind of stuff. Now, when Lenny Curry became mayor along with city council, they did put a lot more money into the Kids Hope Alliance, which is this umbrella organization. It does a lot of programs for youth, a lot of intervention type stuff, prevention, just support for young people as they're growing up. So that's the kind of thing you would think would pay off, but not in a one-year term. It seems like maybe that's going to have some cumulative effects. And going back to 2016, there's been a sort of concerted effort by law enforcement to really identify, focus on the people who are most who are committing the crimes, right? I mean, focus on them, find those people, in some cases intervene, and in some cases prosecute.
Yeah, and Aaron, there has been this idea that, a really small percentage of the overall population of this city are responsible for a larger share of the murders, and typically that's associated with gang violence. But this is a 47% decrease over 2023. It seems, as David says, almost too good to be true. Who is going to ultimately get the credit for this? I mean, Lenny Curry, the former mayor, basically ran on, fighting violent crime that didn't decline in his tenure at all. But of course, this is just the first term of a new mayor.
That is going to be the question of ultimately who gets the credit for this. We do know that it might, because it started back toward the tail end of his tenure, but also looking into Donna Deegan's current tenure, but also just looking at the fact that Sheriff T.K. Waters, this is something that he said right off the bat that this is what he wanted to target. This is what he wanted to concentrate on. And so time and time again, he talked about the fact that this was a goal for him. This is something that he wanted to see happen, and that it is happening. I feel like that's where it's really going to start. And then there are going to be other contributing factors and those who will also get credit. But that was just someone who I initially just thought of right off the bat.
Sure. And I do believe TK, Nikesha, is saying that, this is due to the no nonsense attitude of his law enforcement agency. That was a quote from him. He's, disputed the characterization of Florida as the murder capital. But of course, that is just calculated essentially on a per capita basis as opposed to just, city to city.
I mean, I will give the sheriff credit where credit is due. He's absolutely due credit for making sure that he, as well as his officers, are in the community and meeting people and working to get to know people who live in the communities where crime and violent crime and murders are the highest, and then doing what they can to intervene. He definitely gets credit for that, much more so being out and available into the public, more so than the last sheriff that we had, if we remember correctly. But this is not an issue about who gets to take the victory lap, because it needs to be continued success. And so just as David mentioned that, we saw this in 2011 after we had Jacksonville journey, but then it was defunded, because you cannot invest in programs and invest in people and invest in resources, and then once you see a modicum of success and say, okay, that's done, we'll take the resources away, and then think that things will be all right. We cannot police our way out of crime. That's just not possible. And I've said this before, because crime is the result of something much deeper, which is poverty. So when you invest in programs for youth, when you invest in mental health access, when you invest in making sure that communities and neighborhoods have the basic resources that they need, then that means that people don't have to feel that they're in this desperate place where it's either kill or be killed, which is really what we've seen over the last decade. Also, and in addition to these numbers and drops is a reflection of what we've seen nationally. FBI statistics released earlier this year showed that crime is down across the nation since it was at a high during the pandemic, when again there was a lot of despair, there was a lot of death due to illness, and so then there was a lot of lawlessness and chaos. So we're seeing this happen nationally. Jacksonville is by no means an outlier, but it also is going to need continued investment and success, and that investment is not just into the police force. It should be into the community that's working hand in glove with the police to make sure that crime stays down in communities where it has been highest.
I want to ask you about that too, Rich Donnelly, because this is part of a national trend. I mean, we're seeing historic declines in homicide rates. Baltimore's have declined by 40%. Other cities have seen significant drops. So in terms of, what the city is doing right or what the city needs to keep doing, are we just seeing it falling in alignment with what's happening around the country?
Well, I think certainly when Mayor Donna Deegan came in office, she said she was going to work with federal funding to get federal dollars to come in. And she said there was an issue of previous Republican mayors, for whatever reason, wanting to take a stand against taking money from a Democratic president. And we're not going down that rabbit hole. But if we do believe that JSO is working hand in hand with other federal agencies, FBI, using those federal dollars, then that could go into some of the investigations that lead to some of the work to find criminals. TK Waters has talked often about getting illegal guns off the streets before they're used for a murder. That could be a contributing factor to some of these declining rates. And Sheriff Waters is literally walking the walk. We see him in his community crime prevention neighborhood walks, walking around. And one of the large drug busts and illegal gun busts that he had a press conference about, he said that tip came in from one of his crime walks, where a neighbor said, "This house down the road is a problem." And then over the course of an investigation, undercover officers and that whole process, they determined, yes, there were drugs and guns being funneled from that house, and they made arrests. And not to say that those guns were necessarily going to be used for, homicides 88, 89, 90 that did not happen this year, but it's a possibility. That's just one example of that happening. So we were talking earlier about who gets credit. I think the victory lap will happen in 3 years if this number continues to decline, if this is not just a random number, but a true new trend of policy going forward. So I think it's a job well done, again, if it's a true trend of the work that everyone's been doing, crossing the aisle, so to speak, Republican, Democrat, and just going, the greater good for Jacksonville is more funding for programs that allow kids to be kids and not go down a path of crime, give them outlets from the jump, give financial resources to families, so all of a sudden crime doesn't become a true answer, but there are other paths forward going for these people. So I think the true test will be 2025, 2026. Does 87 become 82, 78 going forward?
Mm-hmm.
But I do think there is a large group of people working together, Democrat, Republican, different agencies. The state attorney's office has programs as well, and I think they're all working in concert.
Yeah. If you're just joining us, we are talking about the biggest news stories of the week with Nikesha Williams, Aaron Farrar, David Bauerlein, and Rich Donnelly. If you'd like to call us and join the conversation, you can reach us at 904-549-2937. You can also email firstcoastconnect@wjct.org or reach out on social media. You can also watch our live stream on YouTube or Facebook. David, I just want to ask, what does constitute a trend? And is it reasonable to hope that this number would actually go down? It does seem like at some point, there would be a plateau. You can't keep going down 47% every year.
Yeah, that's not realistic. And this is a growing city, so you have to look at it in proportion to the growth of the city. Picking up on what you asked about kind of the national trend, and Nikesha talked about how Jacksonville's not an outlier in terms of what we're seeing nationally. It used to be Jacksonville was an outlier in the wrong way. it would be like the governor would come out with some news conference about how crime continues to drop, and then you'd look at a metro area by metro area. Well, not in Jacksonville. And so now it feels like Jacksonville's, for whatever reason, is kind of part of that trend nationally of crime going down. So I would assume if crime continues to go down, then you would think that Jacksonville should have a good opportunity to do so. So I don't think we're going to see another proportionate drop like we've seen this year. I think if it holds where it is year after year, that would be a victory, I think, in terms of actually having a really systemic, permanent shift, turning point towards that type of decrease from where it was year over year for so many decades.
Yeah, Aaron, I mean, it is in a lot of ways the city's unfortunate moniker, the murder capital of Florida. And it really would be a game changer if the city could shed that. I mean, that is a title that it rightfully has held for, most of 100 years.
And it alludes to what you all have been saying, is the fact that people over the years have continued to say that this is what Jacksonville, to a certain extent, was known for in that regard. And so now seeing that change a little bit, I guess, offers some hope, like a sliver of hope, to say, like, okay, we are kind of turning a page, and so that we can't be considered this anymore. And so I think now it's just looking at ways to see what has worked, and can we continue to build on those things, and can we add even more to continue to see that decline. But as you also mentioned, only time will tell.
Yeah. Well, we'll obviously continue to watch that and those numbers, but it sure is good news to start the new year off. I'm going to move on now to some new laws that are taking effect, Rich Donnelly. Some that are quite significant, some that are going to be caught up in the courts for a while. But let's start with the social media restrictions for minors. Tell us a little bit about what that law that took effect on January 1st allows for.
Well, speaking of
or doesn't.
laws caught up in courts right now, if this continues through the courts as it's written right now, kids 14 years and younger cannot be on social media in Florida. Stunning turn of events. If you've seen teenagers at all, they're locked on their phones on every possible platform. I remember going through meetings at different news stations and being told kids aren't on Facebook anymore. You have to go to Instagram to reach the kids. And right about the time then stations started getting used to being on Instagram, they're not on that anymore. You have to go to TikTok and other phrases that I've never even heard of before. I guess I'm officially a dinosaur in that respect. But it also goes into parental oversight of their children. And if 15 years old, you need parental permission in order to be on Facebook. And I don't know the actual technology behind how they're going to be able to authenticate that. And, I don't know if a kid would have to prove a learner's permit or a driver's license. Here I am this old in that respect. I had Facebook back when you had to have a college email address in order to be on Facebook. So when high school kids were all of a sudden on, it was jarring. But the law, at least what it's being described as, is a hopes of helping kids be kids and avoid a mental health pitfall and sort of the doom scrolling we hear all the time with being just locked in Facebook. And then there's also the avenue of this law that hopes to prevent, predators from finding kids or grooming children before true crimes have happened and for horrible situations. So I understand exactly where the law is coming from, but it seems a little bit of a governmental overreach. I mean, it's Facebook.
Yeah. Well, it's a lot of things, right?
It is a lot of things, and it goes. Many laws are governmental overreach as we look into them. It's not just the social media one, but this is the one getting the headlines because so many kids are on social media, but oftentimes we see so many kids having problems with social media that do foster later in their life. Kids are just tied in, but Aaron and I both have very young children, and I presume a battle you might have at home is tablet time and TV time and screen time. And, it's something that this generation of kids, when they're now 14, 15 years old, iPads and phones have always been in their life. Social media has always been in their life. So now it's taking away something as opposed to being able to get something. I think it's a battle that's going well beyond the courts.
David, I want to ask you just about the legal argument that sort of underpins this, because it's an interesting trend, I think, in this administration. We've seen different ways of infringing on free speech, but in arguments that are not framed as infringements on free speech. And you think kind of to the Stop Woke Act, which limited what, schools could say or what employers could say. And that was saying, well, this isn't a free speech. This is about conduct. This is a law that addresses conduct. In this case, this is a law, that is, I guess, intended to prevent addictive features. It's about the functionality of the social media as opposed to the speech. So that, I guess, is a way they're hoping to avoid that claim that this is a free speech infringement.
Right. And I'll be honest, I don't completely understand all the jargon involved in this law, but, some of it has to do with, it has to your point, Ann, it's not the content as it is, does it use algorithms to track you? Does it use these features where this continuous scrolling happens, which is the addictive feature, which is, you see it, people walk in a room and they just sit down and just thumb through their phone.
Well, the word of the year, the last year was brain rot, right?
Yeah,
Which is exactly that.
right. And so what's happening? People are just kind of, it's a behavior that wastes a lot of time. It's not productive. It is addictive for sure. I mean, that's why people are doing it. They're just kind of scrolling, finding something that sort of goes, oh, wow, that was worth my time. So I think that's the intent of it. I think it's got a real difficult row to hoe in terms of being able to withstand a court challenge. I mean, parental consent is, the parents decide whether the child does or doesn't have a phone at that age, does or doesn't use it in this way or that way. So I think it's kind of like, I'll date myself here, growing up when I was a teenager, sneaking into an R-rated movie. I mean, that was back in the day, that was what it was all about. Well, here you're basically saying, if you're under 14, you can't go to the movies at all. And that's kind of a hard thing because all these functions do have all these popular sites do have these features that are addictive in their way in terms of getting people to come back over and over again to them.
But Aaron, as David says, this is also because it's, the way that people use to communicate and connect, not being able to go to any movie, but also not being able to talk to your friends. I mean, if you can't communicate on things like Snapchat and Instagram, where are you going to find those natural friendships that are almost all partly digital, in some cases entirely digital for kids these days?
What's interesting about that, it goes back now, and I hate to play devil's advocate a little bit, but now I think sometimes the focus is like trying to garner this generation to go out and foster those relationships through face-to-face conversations, actually sitting down and talking to someone, ways that were typically done years ago. So that might be one argument. But one thing, as we've covered stories over the last several months leading up to where this stands now, is that parents feel that there is somewhat of an overreach because it limits their ability to parent. Because some parents have said, I want my child to be on social media for this reason, maybe to communicate with them. Maybe that's the only way that they feel comfortable communicating with each other for whatever reason that might be, or just having a parent be able to explain to them or teach their child what to do and what not to do on social media instead of letting government tell them what to do. So that was their argument as we've spoken to a lot of different parents over the last several months as this continued to gain some traction.
Yeah. And Nikesha, I want to shift and just talk about a different law that's also taken effect. It's kind of colloquially called the HALO law, but it basically requires people at a police scene of any kind to give a 25-foot setback if they're asked by police to step back 25 feet. That's about the length of a couple cars. It hasn't been without controversy. Tell us a little bit about what the conversation is.
So the bill as it's written is in regards to first responders. So any first responders, including police officers, correction officers, probation officers, but also firefighters and EMTs, right? But no one, and it's about, harassing them. So like if you're thought to be too close to them while they're, in the middle of doing their duties and they ask you to step back, you have to give them a 25-foot distance. But what I thought was interesting is that to make sure that that they don't feel like the first responder doesn't cause, they're not in emotional distress if you're too close to them that would prevent them or preclude them from doing their duties. And so no one's going to interrupt a firefighter like fighting a fire. No one's going to stop an EMT on the scene from like trying to save somebody's life. So this is very specifically targeted toward, I think, police officers and perhaps activists who may see them on a scene and be questioning their behavior or what they're doing, and maybe want to take out their phone and get video just in case you don't know what's going to happen. And so then the officer can then say, I feel like you're harassing me. I feel like you're too close to me. You're preventing me from doing my job. You need to give me 25 feet space, or you're going to be arrested and you're going to be booked into jail on this line. It'll be a second-degree misdemeanor, right? And so what I find really interesting about this is that, police officers are the ones with the guns. Police officers are the ones with the tasers. They have no real higher power or authority that they answer to. Like when activists are pushing for community review boards and things like that, the police investigate themselves. Even in JSO, like they're not investigated by FDLE if there is some wrongdoing that happens with like a police shooting or anything like that. And so now this is further quelling.
Typically investigated by the state attorney's office and additional to an internal review.
So this is further quelling any kind of dissent or community accountability that people could have that we have seen, not just since George Floyd, but with, the advent of cell phone and cell phone cameras, and making sure that if something is happening on the street where people see a police interaction, they start recording, then you have video of it for posterity. You can say, this is what happened. We've seen that several times in Jacksonville. We've talked about those cases. And so this is now saying, okay, you have to take 25 feet back, or now you're going to be arrested. And I just feel like that's quelling what little transparency and accountability that the community does have to hold police accountable for when they are exactly in the wrong.
25 feet, some might say, though, is not a significant distance. You could zoom your phone. There's also police body cam.
There's also police body cam. You can zoom your phone. Honestly, I don't know that the number or the distance is arbitrary. I just feel like it's another way in this, this wave of Governor DeSantis' stop woke and making sure that all the rhetoric that has come out of Black Lives Matter in the wake of 2020 and since then is just another way to try to further deflate and diffuse that movement that was very much about holding police accountable when Black men and people were killed senselessly on camera and it was on autoplay on the internet.
I was actually at the press conference where Governor DeSantis signed this into law. It was in St. Johns County. The HALO law was signed the same day as the law limiting community review boards from being presented. It was the same day, same location. And I look at some issues here in Jacksonville. Lakean Woods would be in jail right now for a variety of charges had someone not taken a video of him being beaten while being arrested. And that video...
He was the man who was arrested whose face and his mugshot was memorable because it was
very,
so swollen.
very swollen and bloody, and he has multiple internal injuries as well from that. Although the video that was taken from, it appears, more than 25 feet away. And again, not to say that it's valid or invalid because of distance, but you can get a video image from a certain distance away. But again, it's much like the other law, it's presented in a way of allow them to do their job, which is the power of a definition, I guess, in that respect. South Florida had a similar law, but it was 20 feet. So this expands what was on the books in a different jurisdiction within
So it was
the state
overturned.
as well.
Ultimately, they got rid of it because of legal challenges.
And I wonder if, down the road, legal challenges might present this, or if maybe the various lawmakers have found the key words to wiggle in there to avoid that.
Well, I mean, I have seen, Aaron, the complaint that this is unconstitutionally vague, which would make it, illegal under the law, because there's terms that say, things as Nikesha said, if they cause the first responder emotional distress, or if they're impeding a legitimate purpose. But those terms aren't defined. And it sort of is like, who gets to decide? Is it, a neutral observer, or it's the officer or the first responder themselves who is basically tasked with enforcing the law?
And I think that's why it's going to interestingly be a situation where ultimately does not either it ends up being dropped or something of that nature, just because it is so vague, just because there aren't really those defined or just very specific situations that is going to be under. So then that allows someone else to point out, like, hey, does this mean or does this constitute how I feel? Will this rectify the situation? And so it just provides all of these questions more so than answers. And then what's going to happen depending on, and no situation is alike. And I
Right.
think that's
Oh, and you
what's
almost wonder if in some cases it would create additional friction. I mean, if officers are starting to, if they're having to enforce this because somebody isn't observing the setback and having to make arrests, if that in a scene that's already dynamic might create even more of a headache.
to be honest, I feel like the headache is already there. I think at this point, I don't think that there's any more that can be done other than the sense of like it's more of that. See, this is why we this shouldn't have happened in the first place, just because it was already questionable even in the beginning when people even started talking about this a couple of years ago. And so now, as it continues to move forward, it's like, okay, why is it? Why did it get to this point now? And it's already a lot of friction. So to me, I feel like it's not really adding. It's just more of a reason of like, this is why this shouldn't be something that we should be discussing or something that needs to be considered in the first place.
Yeah, David, certainly law enforcement would say, they're doing a very difficult job under difficult circumstances. And if they're doing it when people are shouting at them or kind of encroaching, getting very close to something that they're trying to do, that they would rightfully feel in danger or that they wouldn't be able to do their job at least in an efficient manner.
Well, that could be the case. I mean, there is obviously a lot of moving pieces in any kind of a scene like that. And if somebody's like right there in the scrum with a cell phone, then that obviously adds a lot more complication to it. Um, the 25 feet, the reason these sort of videos are so important is they are accountability. It is a case where people are eyewitnesses and they're not just, oh, it's my word against the officers. There's actual a video that shows here's what actually happened. And as long as it's not doctored or anything like that, that's a video that we can look at. You can compare that to what the narrative is in the police officer's report. You can see in general whether or not the person who was arrested did or didn't resist violently or not. I mean, that was an issue in a lot of cases. Is the force proportionate to what's actually happening? So I think these are really valuable to have this kind of technology, the ability to do it. I don't know, is 25 feet too far? It's too, I don't think it's too far with the Zoom, as long as you can hear what's being said. It seems like it can still be a useful tool for people to be there on the scene. Would there possibly be some angles that you can get as where if you're closer that you could actually see better? Probably. So it's gonna diminish somewhat the ability of those videos. And the other part is, the whole question of what is harassment. If someone's 20 feet away and they're told to step away and they say no, are they harassing the officers by being 20 feet away? That's, I think, where some of the legal act challenges have come in the past and probably would again if someone's arrested and put in jail for taking video of something like this.
Yeah. Well, if you're just joining us, we're talking about the news of the week with our 4 excellent journalists. You can join the conversation by giving us a call at 904-549-2937. You can also email us at firstcoastconnect@wjct.org or reach out on social media. Nikesha, I want to move on to the topic that is not local, but it is of significance to a lot of people. And you included this attack that happened on Bourbon Street on New Year's Eve. You have family in New Orleans. You've written books set in New Orleans. What are you hearing, first of all, from your loved ones? What is the latest on this investigation?
My loved ones weren't there. So Bourbon Street is a tourist hotspot. So my family for New Year's Eve were not in the French Quarter. But as far as like what happened, what's happening, there was a report that came out in 2019 that talked about that Bourbon Street could be a target for terrorist attacks, and so they didn't have enough security there. So they had the bollards put up. The bollards got filled with Mardi Gras beads and are no longer in operable
And
condition.
those are basically kind of stanchions that keep people
to
from
keep people
blocking
and
vehicles.
and to keep vehicles from coming down the street or onto the sidewalks or things like that. And I believe it started in November. the city of New Orleans had started trying to like ramp up security in the French Quarter leading up to the Super Bowl that's coming up. All that to say, the barricades were not in place on the day of the attack. The police cars were there trying to block and hold that line, and the attacker went around them. And so we have 14 people killed in a very pedestrian dense area of a
I think
very
it might be 15 at this point, even.
It's gone back and forth.
it's
Yeah,
gone back and
okay.
forth. The number I saw this morning was 14. I saw 15 yesterday, so I'm going
Okay.
with the latest I saw. But more than a dozen people have been killed in a very pedestrian dense area, in a very heavily trafficked area that is a famous spot for tourists, and it brings up the matter of safety. It brings up the matter of what could have been done to prevent it, who's to blame. All of those questions are out there. But I think what people are forgetting about New Orleans, as famous as it is a small city. And if you think about, like, we're all journalist television markets, it is a smaller market than Jacksonville, right? So it has big city vibes all day long, but it is a small city. It doesn't have a lot of budget. I don't want to be defamatory and say that it's poor, but it has its challenges. And so what has happened is a tragedy, and could it have been prevented? Absolutely. Do they need to do more to prevent it from happening again? Absolutely. Mardi Gras is coming up. The Super Bowl is coming up. St. Joseph's Day is coming up. Jazz Fest is coming up. There is something to do every weekend in New Orleans if you would like it, if you would like to. And so there's going to have to be something done. And what that is more security, maybe better intel, and that's something that the police, the administration, and even the federal government will have to decide in the city of New Orleans.
Rich, this is obviously part of a much larger trend of these kind of vehicle-based attacks, that allow people that may not have access to weapons or, anything that could be massively destructive to cause enormous damage. It's been happening in Europe, obviously been happening here. I actually saw a statistic about, it had happened so many times just in the months after George Floyd was killed, where crowds of protesters had cars driving into them, through them. We all remember Charlottesville. So what is it? It makes it a very difficult thing to defend. There are so many places where cars are.
Well, especially because the vehicle that was driven was not owned by the terrorist who drove it into the crowd of people. He rented it on a site called Turo, which is like Airbnb for vehicles. It wasn't even his. So all of a sudden you have to defend against a moving target, truly, that you don't even know where a bad actor would be able to get a vehicle like that necessarily, if he could just rent one on the day that he feels it's his time to commit those acts. The Gator Bowl was just here in Jacksonville yesterday, and the story that I did was similarly pedestrian safety. Like, okay, so we have metal detectors. You're not going to bring a weapon into the game. We've secured the stadium itself. How about getting to the stadium? You park at, tailgaters lots, on the other side of the stadium, or take the water taxi. You have to cross Gator Bowl Boulevard. What can police do to prevent a situation like that from someone driving down the Hart Bridge at a high rate of speed, going around an orange traffic cone? It's admittedly a soft spot, so to speak, in protection. And JSO and nor the city gave exact instances of the way that they were going to enhance security, but I can tell you firsthand there was a massive police presence at a game in which the upper deck seemed to be roped off, and there were plenty of tickets. So it seemed they did not say that they were enhancing security because of New Orleans. And both JSO and the city said that this was a year-round approach, that they always prepare for large events like the Gator Bowl in Florida, Georgia, and different Jags games, concerts, things like that. But it seemed like a far larger presence than any Gator Bowl that I've covered in previous years. And that was just walking across Gator Bowl Boulevard to go from Met Park to the stadium.
Sure. I mean, Aaron, initially when this, first happened, because there was an ISIS flag on this gentleman's car, there was a lot of concern that this was part of a much larger effort, for a lot of cities like even Jacksonville to be watching for possible, terrorist attacks. But apparently no connection there. Now they're saying it just was a single actor.
Just a single actor that made a decision for whatever reason he felt he needed or wanted to make a point or do something. But I do want to go back quickly to what Rich just talked about. what's interesting is going to be curious of what all of these different bigger venues end up doing, how long that's going to last. Will it revert back to the way they typically do things eventually when things start kind of going back to the way they were before all of this happened? I had a family friend who went to the game in New Orleans yesterday, and one thing that stood out to me is he said, which he usually does not do, is he walked to the game just because of the status of them visiting the city. And he said that it was easier yesterday to get into the stadium just without a car than what he's ever experienced at a typical collegiate game. He said what he noticed was there was a big focus on just people who were driving to the game. So the people had to go through all of these different checkpoints, more than one, 2 or 3 different challenges to get to wherever their parking space was. But now that it begs to question, okay, is there going to be a stronger focus at any type of football game or any event in New Orleans for those who are not driving to the game? Why was there just and I know that there was going to be a focus on people who were driving for sure because of this of what happened, but did they know that people were going to have that mentality like, wow, it was surprisingly easy to get through this security checkpoint as someone who walked to the game? And does that pose another concern to other people who may think like, wow, if this is the way it was getting into the game this time or to this venue, should I be concerned that there might be danger elsewhere where you're not really having that attention that you should
Well,
have?
David, I mean, I was just going to say this whole issue of cars. I mean, there was this other incident that happened outside of the Trump Hotel in Las Vegas. Also, a car incident. There are a lot of places like stadiums and city halls that have really hardened against terrorism since 9/11. But there are so many places with pedestrians and vehicles, and it doesn't seem even feasible to try to address that enormous soft target that exists.
I don't think it is feasible. I mean, we've seen stories about how an elderly driver, fell asleep at the wheel and drives into a crowd, and it turns out that's what it was. And there's a lot of cases where there's a mass of people, and a car can do a lot of damage in a very few seconds because of just the weight and speed of a car. So I don't know, how do you defend against that? Do you have like bollards everywhere? Or are we like,
I mean, they do in Amsterdam. There are some cities
I
that, but it
guess.
is in a city like Jacksonville. Doesn't seem
Very difficult. Yeah. And I'll just pick up on what you mentioned about the ISIS flag. I think I'm really interested in finding out, how did this person get to the point where they took this kind of action? He was born and raised in Beaumont. I lived for a few years in Beaumont. It's just a blue collar working class city. The only thing people are fanatical about in Beaumont is the Dallas Cowboys. And yet somehow this person grew up in America,
I believe
seemed to have
served
some
in the
life
Army, too.
setbacks.
Served in the military.
Went to the military, and then this happened. I think there's some lessons need to be learned there and figure out what happened.
I just want to move on to another headline this week in the little time we have left. Kind of crazy news about what the storms have wrought beyond flooding and property damage. Now they're saying that Helene could have spread as many as 222 non-native species throughout the state and other places. Milton, 114 possible invasive species, including the Burmese python.
So the Burmese python was the one that was not really that much of a surprise, only because they have that challenge throughout Florida of like having people a certain amount of time trying to find the Burmese python. And of course, the hurricanes didn't help that. But the one thing that stood out to me was the fact that these two storms happened so close to each other, and that was one of the bigger factors that led to some of these species getting to different places throughout Florida. But one thing that I even saw just from covering different storms that people probably don't really think about is the fact that in these smaller communities, and I'm not sure if this can possibly come up as more research is done, but the bigger topic was these common communities that would typically flood all the time, and people were wondering why. And part of that was because of not only debris, but just of some of these potentially invasive plants getting clogged in drainage systems, and the water doesn't have anywhere to go once it gets to a certain level. So the only place for it to go was back into these communities. And so I remember being out on a story on the north side where that was a big topic of conversation, and even that specific day, Public Works had to go, and they said, hey, this is the problem. There are 3 or 4 different drain systems that are all clogged, and now researchers are saying a possible reason for that is because of these invasive plants that might be just finding their way through these pathways because of high water and because of the timing of the 2 storms. It's just
Right,
was
back to back.
a natural way for it to get into these communities.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the great irony, David, is that the original spread of the Burmese python is now credited to a python breeding ground that was destroyed in Hurricane Andrew, and that basically has just in a few years decimated almost all of the kind of wildlife of the Everglades.
Yeah, it's a wild phenomenon, isn't it? How something that's completely non-native to Florida, and that's the story of Florida. There's a lot of non-native stuff in our state of Florida.
Well, Nikesha Williams, David Bauerlein, Rich Donnelly, Aaron Farrar, thank you all so much for being here today. Really appreciate it, and Happy New Year.
Happy
New Year.
Happy
Thank
New
you.
Year.
Thanks.
All right, up next.
In 2025, the legend returns to the big screen at WJCT Studios. Join us for Elvis's 90th birthday celebration with a special screening of Elvis. That's the way it is. Doors open at 6:30. Film begins at 7. January 15th, 2025 at WJCT Studios. Visit wjct.org/events for tickets.
On the next Fresh Air, we'll continue listening back to some of our favorite interviews of the year with comic Nikki Glazer. Glazer is known for telling scathing jokes at celebrity roasts. Her appearance on this year's roast of Tom Brady made headlines. She'll be hosting the Golden Globes Awards ceremony on January 5th. Join us.
Today at 1 on WJCT News 89.9.
On the next Florida Roundup.
I think that Florida is developing now as an innovation power center.
I think Florida is in a prime space to really take advantage of the explosion that I think is coming in this market.
An outsider coming to Miami is immediately struck by the fact that it doesn't bear any resemblance to any other city in the United States, right?
Different takes on Florida's economy, the environment for business, and shall we say its layered reputation? I'm Tom Hudson. Join us noon until 1.
It's a new year with a country waiting to see how different the new administration will be from the old. Every Friday, we drill down on all the important stories playing out here in the nation's capital and across the country. Join us for the first Friday News Roundup of 2025, next time on 1A.
Today starting at 10 on WJCT News 89.9.
Welcome back. Well, from the controversial to the celebratory, the St. Augustine Film Festival is screening more than 36 independent and foreign films over a 4-day period. Here to tell us about this year's slate of films is Gregory Von Hausch, the co-director of the St. Augustine Film Festival. Welcome back, Gregory.
Thanks, Ann. It's great to be here.
So there are a number of films for people to be focusing on. This event is January 9th through the 12th, and there's a lot of films to choose from. So first of all, what's the film you're loving the most to talk about?
Well, what I really try to do with the programming is to be very eclectic and do as many countries as possible. Some of the films we have, The Way, My Way, it deals with walking the Camino. It's from Australia, but it's a real-life encounter. It's hysterically funny about an octogenarian that decides on a whim, I'm going to walk the Camino. So I love
for people who
that
don't
film.
know the Camino.
The Camino is the walk, pilgrimage that you take from the mountains to Barcelona, and all along the way, it's 800 kilometers of walking and reflecting, and it's really a remarkable film and journey.
The opening film, though, is not a foreign film, right? It is The Queen of the Ring.
Right, and it's directed by Ash Avildsen. His dad, John Avildsen, directed Rocky, Karate Kid. This is a true story about a female wrestler in 1935 who becomes the first female athlete to make $1 million.
Mildred Burke.
Yeah, incredible story. I believe the star will be here. Ash will be here. The producer, who's from Jacksonville, Amy Shoof, is here.
Oh, I didn't know there was a Jacksonville connection. That's great. There's also, for the surfers out there, The Shape of Things, a story about Dick Brewer, who is, of course, a legendary Hawaii hand shaper of surfboards.
Right, and he was instrumental in being the maverick that blazed all the new frontier for surfing. It's a wonderful film because it's a retro film. You get back into the early days of surfing, the soundtrack, the current events of the days. It's fabulous. And the director and producer will be here, as will Jericho Poplar, one of the top female surfers in the world, who's in the film.
So there is some lighter fare, but some really intense new films as well, including Supernova. Tell us about that.
Supernova is a film all about the massacre, October 7th in Israel. And it's mainly shot from the cell phones of survivors and non-survivors as they're being chased by the terrorists. It will keep you on the edge of your seat. It's just a remarkable film, and it's an important film too.
What about one called River Boom? That's another foreign film.
Right, it's from Afghanistan, and you never think of an Afghani film being a comedy, but it's about three European reporters that go to Afghanistan to do a video diary, and it is hysterically funny, and you're also on the edge of your seat because these guys don't know what's going on, and the warlords, and they go and interview them. It's really remarkable. It's winning awards around the world, and this is one of the U.S. premieres of it.
There's a bunch of Florida films, and I definitely want to note one by director Boaz DeVere, because he was the former editor of the Jacksonville Business Journal. He used to do commentaries here at WJCT. He was on the Week in Review, and now he's a acclaimed documentary filmmaker. This is like at least his third.
Oh, it's more than that. We've probably done 4 or 5 of his films at the festival. He's been to it. This one takes place in Gainesville, about a teacher who was teaching at an F school, and
she's in it. It's a documentary about her, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And so she turns the whole thing around with her own way of teaching, throws out the lesson plans, throws out what Tallahassee wants, and turns it in 1 year from an F to an A. You'll stand up and cheer, really.
And that's called Class of Her Own.
Right.
But there's also another documentary about Florida called Women of the Watershed.
Right. This is about the river of grass,
Everglades,
and people that have made a difference in the protection of that.
Tell us, there's an honoree that is coming, Julia Ormond. She has been in many, many movies. She was in The Walking Dead. She was on television. She was
Sabrina. She was in The Curious Case of Benjamin Button. She was, the first time I ever saw her, she was Smilla in Smilla's Sense of Snow, which opened the Berlin Festival, which is where I met her in 1997. She's a remarkable actress. And this film is, once again, you don't expect it to be funny because it deals with dementia, but it won our festival down south, and it's remarkable. Her husband, who's a wonderful man, all of a sudden starts slipping away, and it's all about how you deal with it, with a lot of comedy. And it's called Here's Yanni because he thinks he's Johnny Carson, and his name is Yanni, and he does his own show. It's a remarkable film. And Julia will be there and get the Lifetime Achievement Award.
And she's obviously also done a lot of things fighting trafficking and slavery. And so she really is kind of an ambassador for
around the globe.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
All right. So there's a lot of films to choose from. People can go to StAugustinefilmfest.com.
It's St. Aug Film Fest.
Excuse me, StAugFilmFestival.com. And there are $10 films individually, but there's also all access passes available. It runs January 9th through 12th.
9 through 12, StAugFilmFest.com.
All right. Thanks so much, Gregory Von Hausch. Thanks for being here. Appreciate it. I'm Ann Schindler. You've been listening to First Coast Connect on WJCT News 89.9.
Support for First Coast Connect is provided by Baptist Health and the North Florida TPO.
Baptist Health is a proud supporter of First Coast Connect. Baptist Health, committed to building a healthier community for all of us. More info at 202-4YOU or baptistjacks.com. Terrell Hogan Law.
I'm Wayne Hogan. Serious injury cases can be complex, and our trial attorneys find and present the evidence juries need to see.
More at terrellhoganlaw.com.
This is David McGowan, CEO of WJCT Public Media, here to say quick thank you to all of you who responded to our ask of support during our recent on-air pledge drive. It takes all of us to make this radio station happen. Thank you.